What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Eddie Liger Power Hour. Where we have fast cars and tickets to anywhere. Doing chest and trides while slapping this. Nice. I gotta go get a lift in after the stream, actually. So get huge. Solidarity with all the lifting comrades out there. Hello. Oh, shit. Tracy Chapman. You bet. I tried to play that for TikTok the other day. It didn't work. Can you play Yesterday? I actually used to be able to play not even just Yesterday, but a finger style version of Yesterday that also played like the melody, like the singing, the lyrics. But it played it on guitar. I don't know how to do it anymore though. I can only remember so many like finger style songs at once because they're pretty long and difficult. I don't even remember how to do that one right now. All right, I've got quite the show planned for you all today. I just ordered some new books by Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Anna Louise Strong. Nice. How are you this afternoon? I'm good. I worked this morning at my part-time job at the gymnastics gym, teaching little kids gymnastics. So that was fun. Tracy Chapman's voice was so good it was. What are we chatting about today? Yeah, I've got a great show planned today. We're going to be talking about the Restrict Act, which is a bill that Congress is looking to pass that would affect all of us because it would allow the Secretary of Commerce to see all exchanges of information and label any information that they want as a national security threat. And not only could they then remove that information that was labeled as a national security threat, but they could throw you in jail for 20 years for spreading that information. So I could get put in jail for 20 years for my TikToks. And of course, this is scary because we've had 3 TikTok accounts banned now, under accusations of spreading conspiracy theories or misinformation. But all the information that we spread on TikTok, lo and behold, has turned out to be true. And it's turned out that the U.S. media, believe it or not, has been lying about, say, the situation in Ukraine and falsely claiming that anybody telling the truth about the situation in Ukraine is a Russian bot, is a national security threat. So now this new act would allow them to not just ban us, but toss us in jail for telling the truth. And who cares if it turns out, or if later information comes out that shows that you're telling the truth. If the Secretary of Commerce says that you're a national security threat, under this act, you're a national security threat and you're going to jail. So we're going to cover that. We're going to cover the media's response to it, some of the sycophantic bootlicking, disgusting excuses for journalistic outlets like USA Today, who have been encouraging this act and claiming that anybody critical of the act is a liar. So we're going to be talking about that. We'll talk a little bit about Biden's influence arm on TikTok, just because I think it goes hand in hand with the fact that TikTok and other social media outlets are banning people, claiming that people are connected to the Russian government when they're not, claiming that people are national security threats when they're not. Meanwhile, Biden and the DNC are openly funding an arm of influencers on social media. So it's okay for people to take money from the U.S. government and push narratives that are useful to the U.S. government. If you're critical of the U.S. government, well, then you're a Russian bot. Then you're a national security threat. Then you need to be taken off the internet, even if you have no connection to the Kremlin or no connection to Russia. Being a Biden bot is okay. We'll also talk about Facebook censoring Seymour Hersh. While we're on the topic of online media censorship, we'll do a bigger video criticizing Armchair Historian, who you guys have wanted me to talk about forever. I'm always being sent Armchair Historians videos, and people are asking me to respond, similar to how we responded to Oversimplified, these sort of cartoon history videos that are oftentimes just giving the Western hegemonic capitalist narrative, imperialist narrative about certain issues. And then after that, if we have time, we'll talk about David Goggins a little bit. So it should be a fun stream. I'm very excited. I hope you're excited too. If you guys have some stuff that you want me to talk about or you want me to react to, put it in the chat now while I play the introduction. I'll look at it and maybe we'll cover some of that stuff. If not, we'll just stick with what our plan for today currently is. So I'll be back in a minute after this intro. All right. Well, we already got 20 euros from Ross. Thank you very much, Ross. Make sure to check out Ross's Substack, where he writes articles, oftentimes related to the subjects that we talk about on stream. So thank you so much for Ross. Great way to get the stream started. David Burney also jumping in with a $5 super sticker. Thank you so much, David, the original Midwestern Marks Patreon supporter. Couldn't do it without you guys. So thank you for that financial support. Appreciate it more than I can put into words. We'll answer a couple questions here. What are your opinion on supersets? I love them. I love like CrossFit workouts and like cardio lifts. I don't do only supersets. There are sets where I'll take a rest in between. But at least half of the lifts that I do, I usually superset with something else. I fully understand dialectical materialism now. It's literally just atheism for economics. It is materialism. It's materialism applied to economics and applied to politics. Because bourgeois politics, bourgeois economics are just irrational expressions of the capitalist ruling class. Like neoclassical economics is just what the capitalist class, or the framework that the capitalist class wants you to see economics through. But Marxism or dialectical materialism is just a materialist, unbiased application to economics and politics. So it is similar to like Marx and Engels were heavily inspired by Darwin, right? And this relates to what you're saying about atheism. because Darwin saw the development of different species and the development of different categories over time based on their environment, based on their material reality. So where Darwin sort of applied materialism to biology and developmental biology, Marx did that for economics and the development of human society. So yeah, I think I get what you're saying there with Marxism being atheism. I mean, you could nitpick that statement too, but I get what you're saying. Lowell, air chair historian is a right-wing historian. Why would anyone care? He's clearly a right-wing hack. Yeah, I don't know. I think that about a lot of people, you know, but a lot of people like armchair historian get millions and millions and millions of views. So we might not care as Marxists, as dialectical materialists, as historical materialists who can spot where people like armchair historian are wrong or where they're distorting the truth. But there are tons and tons of people who believe armchair historians' videos, millions of people, in fact. Similar with PragerU, similar with other outlets like that. And I know some people don't like when we criticize these outlets and they say, you know, shouldn't everybody realize that these outlets are wrong? I mean, yeah, I guess, but they're still getting millions of views, right? Millions of people think that these outlets are telling the truth. So it's worth it to take the time to analyze what they're saying and deconstruct it for people and show people where it's actually wrong. Monopoly capitalist news is just marketing masquerading as journalism. Absolutely. It's just marketing for the bourgeoisie. And we're going to see that with this USA Today article. It's so ridiculous. So ridiculous. I can't even put this into words. So materialism frees the mind. Agreed. So let's jump into first here because this is interesting. If our stream gets pulled down right in the middle of me talking about something, you know that the Restrict Act passed and the Secretary of Commerce labeled me as a national security threat. So this Restrict Act is already gaining bipartisan support in Congress. You know, there's already support from Democrats and Republicans to start censoring social media, start labeling anybody who they don't like as a national security threat and throwing them in jail. Extremely scary stuff here. The horrors of socialism bill that they signed a while back was just like a Trojan horse, like them getting their foot in the door. Like, hey, you know how it says in the Constitution that we're going to protect your right to political expression and free speech? Well, we lied. We're actually going to ban socialism because socialism's evil. And now this is another step in that direction where they would basically, the Secretary of Commerce would be able to see any transaction of information, and they could label any information that they want to get rid of as a national security threat. And then they would have the right to remove it and throw the person who was spreading that information in jail for 20 years. So terrible. I'm sure that Bernie Sanders and AOC and the fraud squad will get on board with this. And they'll say, yeah, we need to censor your political speech to defeat Trump or whatever. They'll come up with some excuse for it. We need more censorship because Republicans. But extremely scary stuff. Not surprised to see that it has bipartisan support. We've been seeing the Biden administration increasingly crack down on social media, on online communication, while the DNC and the Biden administration continues to invest in social media influencing, right? So our account has been suppressed multiple times, and we've been accused of being Russian bots or Russian plants, despite the fact that we have no connection whatsoever with the Kremlin. I'm literally just a guy in my bedroom trying to bring you the news, theory, and politics. But we still got our accounts removed, an account with 400,000 followers removed for being attached to the Kremlin when we're not attached to the Kremlin. Yet there are all these influencers on TikTok being paid directly by Biden, being paid directly by the DNC. They're open about it. And those aren't considered American bots. Those aren't considered Biden plants, right? You're allowed to spread propaganda as long as it's on at the behest of the imperialists. But as soon as you criticize the imperialists, you're a Kremlin asset, you're evil, and your account's going to be suppressed. So it's totally ridiculous. And of course, there are already journalistic outlets pointing out that this is just a blatant violation of the First Amendment, a blatant violation of what's supposed to be freedom of speech and freedom of political expression in this country, although we know that we haven't had that for a very long time, or maybe have never had that. And this article here is okay. It says the Broad, Vague, Restrict Act is a dangerous substitute for comprehensive data privacy legislation. So, of course, whatever data privacy legislation the U.S. Congress, the dictatorship of capital, comes up with is not going to be thorough. It's not going to be actually designed to protect people's data. It's going to be designed to censor people who are critical of the empire, critical of capitalism, because the state's only goal is to uphold capitalism, uphold the ruling class, while pretending to be looking out for all of our interests. So whatever they came up with, it was going to be something like the Restrict Act, right? We know that Congress isn't actually trying to protect anyone's data. They're trying to use data security as an excuse to censor people. So, this article's okay. It's critical of the Restrict Act, but it's like, here's what we should do instead, when in reality, we should just have a revolution and overthrow these decrepit politicians instead. But there are also outlets in one of the most disgusting, subservient displays of bootlicking I have ever seen. There are media outlets encouraging the Restrict Act, encouraging this violation of the First Amendment that would allow the Secretary of Commerce to restrict the communication and information from anybody that they want. So USA Today did a fact check. And at this point, I am so sick of these fact checks from Politico or from USA Today or whatever. Anytime somebody's critical of the Biden administration or the US government, they do fact check, and then it's always just a total lie, right? There's somebody making a valid critique of the Biden administration, and then these guys come in and they fact check it. And spread run a bunch of interference for the Biden administration and for the ruling class. So here we have from USA Today, fact checked. No, this is like, there's no way to read this title and not have it be in a super condescending tone, the way that it's been written. Fact check. No, Restrict Act doesn't give government unfettered access to personal devices. Yes, it does. That's exactly what it does. And even if we read their article, you're going to see that. So the claim, the Restrict Act allows the government to monitor all devices, access Wi-Fi, and criminalize VPN. An April 11th Instagram video, direct link, here's the link, shows a man discussing steps taken to destroy America and cites the Restrict Act as one of those steps. It's wrapped up in a TikTok ban, which everybody's excited about. But that's not it. They want to be able to look at all of your devices at your home, access your Wi-Fi network, charge you with a felony, and charge you $1 million for having a VPN. So already the NSA, we know this because of Edward Snowden, can spy on all of your personal devices. So the government can already do this if they want. But the Restrict Act makes it more legal, and it gives them, like you said, the ability to charge people with felonies for spreading information that the Biden administration or the Secretary of Commerce deems as a national security threat. The man also claims that FedNow service will create a central digital bank currency, leading to total government control. I mean, that's we've talked about that before, but that doesn't have too much to do with this. R rating, false. This is false. The government will not be given control over your information and your personal devices. The Restrict Act does not allow the government to monitor a person's devices, access their Wi-Fi network, or criminalize VPNs, according to legal experts and the bill's sponsors. According to the bill's sponsors, right? So the corrupt politicians who wrote this bill, they told us that they're not going to use it to censor us. Oh, I had no idea. Because corrupt politicians in the U.S. government always tell the truth, right? The government that's currently persecuting Julian Assange and holding him in custody and trying to extradite him to the United States so they can prosecute him under the Espionage Act and lock him up for good because he exposed that the U.S. government was mowing down civilians in a military helicopter, among other U.S. war crimes. I'm supposed to trust those bill sponsors, that government? Those are your experts? Like, it's so funny because the media is supposed to be a watchdog, right? A government watchdog. The media is always critical of the government, always, questioning the government's claims. But then the U.S. media is the exact opposite. It's a government lapdog. It's, oh, you think that the government is trying to censor you? Well, we talked to the government and they said they're not. So fact check. Like, you guys aren't just supposed to believe whatever the corrupt politicians tell you. You're not just supposed to take the bill sponsors' words as fact. You're supposed to be critical of them. You're supposed to analyze what they're saying and critique it for the benefit of the people, because we know that politicians tend to lie to us and try to censor us. But USA Today is doing the opposite, which goes back to what someone said earlier, that the monopoly media is just a marketer for the government. It's just a marketer for the ruling class. The idea that this whatever this journalist's name is, the idea that she's a journalist is a joke, right? This is not journalism. This is marketing on behalf of the ruling class to try and help them push for censorship. In addition, the Post misleads on the FedNow service, which won't create a central bank digital currency. Like I said, doesn't have much to do with this. The bill doesn't allow the government to monitor devices or access Wi-Fi. The Restrict Act, or the Restricting Emergency of Security Threats, was introduced to the Senate on March 7th by Mark Warner, a group of lawmakers. The bill gives the Secretary of Commerce authority to identify, deter, disrupt, prevent, prohibit, investigate, or otherwise mitigate any transaction involving information and communication technology. Like, is this a real fucking article? Like, you sat down as someone who calls themselves a journalist and you really wrote this. Like, it's hard to believe this is even real. No, this bill will not allow the government to see whatever information they want and censor whatever information they want. All that the bill would allow the government to do is see any information they want and censor any information they want. Like, what is this fact check then? You're admitting right here that this idea that this bill will allow the government to censor whoever they want is true. You're admitting that that's true. But then in the paragraph above, you said that it's not true. It's because the bill's sponsors told you that it's not true. Oh my gosh, it's insane. Oh, because they would only censor things that are linked to foreign adversaries or pose an undue or unacceptable risk. You know, at a time where everybody who's critical of Biden and critical of the war in Ukraine is being called a Kremlin asset, is being called a puppet of Putin, even though none of us are, even though all of us just want to prevent World War III, right? Every voice trying to prevent World War III is being called a puppet of Putin right now. But we trust the government to only ban people who are actually foreign adversaries? Like, this is a joke. We've had 3 of our accounts banned for being, Russian bots or spreading Russian information when we have no connection to Russia whatsoever. The Uruhu movement in St. Louis are these black socialists who are currently being prosecuted because apparently they're Russian agents, when they're not. They're just people who don't want to push the country towards World War III, push the world towards World War III. So this is just a disgusting joke of an article from USA Today, a fact check. And this Suriksha Kochi should be ashamed and should stop calling herself a journalist and start calling herself what she is, an absolute and utter bootlicker and a stenographer to power. Someone who lies to the American public on behalf of the government, not somebody who serves as a government watchdog. Absolutely insane. Fact checks for morons, literally. And it's wild. Wild. Bro, they're literally just testing the masses as we continue to fail to see how subservient we will be. It's true. And the fact that this doesn't enrage, everyone, and it kind of does. I mean, I'm sure the Restrict Act, for people who know what it is causing a lot of anger. But I don't know. It's almost like they're just seeing how far they can push us, before they actually just make it illegal to be a socialist and make it illegal to be an anti-imperialist. It's so gross. How long before they start throwing us out of helicopters? Well, if you're a national security threat, right? They're going to sign the helicopter throwing bill into law soon that makes it legal to throw people out of helicopters if they're national security threats. But USA Today did a fact check, right? And a lot of people are worried about that bill, because it'll legalize tossing people out of helicopters. But USA Today's fact check said they're only going to be able to throw national security threats out of helicopters. So anybody who Joe Biden decides is a national security threat, whether they are or not, they can be tossed out of a helicopter. But that's okay. That's okay because we need to do it for national security. It's insane. They've been doing this slowly for decades now. True, it all started with I don't even know if this is where it all started, but the Patriot Act is definitely a place where you can trace it back to in the NSA. So soon I'm going to end up in jail for making YouTube videos and TikToks, but it's because I'm a national security threat, because I don't want World War III, because I don't want to provoke Russia to nuclear warfare. I'm a national security threat and I can be thrown in jail. And then USA Today will do a fact check and be like, nope, Eddie Liger Smith actually wasn't thrown in jail for no reason. He was a puppet of Putin. So it's okay. It's good. Woo! I got to take that off, folks. I'm getting hot. It starts with the Espionage Act of 1917. True. And now we have journalists being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. There's no length they won't go to censor us. So imagine being a journalist. Imagine calling yourself a journalist and then writing something like that for a paycheck. Writing something that's going to encourage the censorship of journalists. Especially, it's going to encourage the censorship of independent journalists, right? Because people like me, people who actually tell the truth, I can't work for USA Today. I can't work for MSNBC. I can't work for CNN because those are propaganda outlets for the capitalist ruling class. So then these stenographers to power, these simps to the capitalist ruling class who do have nice cushy jobs working for USA Today, are writing articles encouraging the censorship and the jailing of real journalists. So the corporate journalists are writing articles encouraging the censorship of real journalists who are actually doing their job, who are actually doing the job that these USA Today journalists are supposed to be doing. So it is the most disgusting thing ever. It's hiding behind the ruling class and helping the ruling class attack the real journalists as you fail to do your job and as you act as a stenographer to power. The whole word journalism is a joke at this point because of outlets like USA Today and the simps to power who write for them for a paycheck. Hope it's worth it. Hope it's worth it, you guys. No one else on the left is even talking about all the repression happening under Biden. It's pathetic. It's true. Right, there are people on the left, and I haven't seen what Voosh and his ilk are saying about this, but there are people on the left who are like, well, we need to crack down on this to stop Trump. We need to do this to stop Trump. Do you really think you trust the U.S. government? For one, you shouldn't just be able to censor Trump and the Trump people. They have freedom of speech too under the Constitution. And it's not a democracy if certain political groups are just permanently banned because you don't like them. But you really think that the U.S. government, who's overthrown 60 million governments since the end of World War II and censored and attacked and smeared anybody who criticized them for it, you think they're just going to restrict the bad guys? They're just going to censor the bad guys, the foreign agents or whatever? No, they're going to censor anybody who's critical of them. They're going to censor anybody who's anti-war. They're going to censor anybody who's anti-capitalist. Fucking duh. Obviously. But then there are people on the left who are, still cucked by the Democrats to the point where they'll encourage ruling class censorship because Trump bad, Trump evil. You got to censor everybody on the internet before another January 6th happens. Can you cover the New York City subway killing? I covered that on TikTok. Yeah, follow the TikTok Edward Liger Smith. Thank you for the super chat. But I did cover that already. Wrong. It's only 59,000 governments overthrown. Fact checked. Yeah, there you go. That's USA Today. That's their fact check. I'm so sick of the fact checks because it's so condescending. They just have this air of authority, right? Like what they're saying is opinion, or it's either an opinion or it's a blatant lie. Like the article we just looked at was a blatant lie. But they'll just say fact check, and because they're a mainstream corporate outlet, a lot of people will just read that headline and accept it as truth. Right? Oh, Politico did a fact check. Oh, USA Today did a fact check. They're just looking at the facts. No, they're not. They're fucking lying. They're lying, and then they're saying it's a fact check because they know that people are going to accept what they say as truth just because of their position within the establishment, because they're legacy media, because they're mainstream. Gotta go, but good convo, you bet. Thanks for coming by. It's so absurd, and everybody needs to understand that the government is a dictatorship of capital that has to pretend to be a democracy, right? All this stuff about freedom and democracy, it's just a head fake, right? It's just them trying to invert reality, when all that the government is a tool of suppression by the ruling class against the laboring class, and a tool for expanding capital via wars and sanctions and debt trapping abroad. So anything that they claim to be doing for freedom and democracy, there are always ulterior motives, right? The freedom and democracy is just what they say to justify their suppression of the working class. Every single time. And Lenin called this way back in the day. So it makes sense that the Restrict Act is being pushed and that the ruling class is looking to do more censorship, because Biden's influencer arm, these influencers who he's been paying to make TikToks, have not been doing as well as expected or as well as they thought. So some of these Gen Z activists were complaining to Biden that he sucks too bad to sell to young voters. It's a hard sell. Gen Z activists warned Biden over frustration among young voters. So Biden hired all these TikTok influencers to push for him. And they're coming back from TikTok and saying, we just can't do it, man. We can't sell Biden to young voters. He sucks too bad. He's not doing anything for young voters. How are we supposed to convince them to vote for him? So this is hilarious. It's also hilarious that I know some of these TikTok influencers who are being paid by Biden. And I had my TikTok accounts removed as TikTok was claiming they were removing Russian bots, when of course I've never had any connection to Russia or the Russian government. And yet there are these influencers who are openly, directly connected to the Biden administration, right? So why aren't they considered Biden bots? Right? Why is it okay to take money from the U.S. government and push their narrative, but not the Russian government? And they're even accusing people who aren't connected to the Russian government of being connected to the Russian government so they can censor them, while people who are actually connected to the most murderous, exploitative, imperialist government on the planet, are free to do so. And they're free to complain in public that it's really hard to brainwash the youth into voting for Biden. Oh, it's so funny. It's so funny. Nobody trusts you guys anymore. Nobody buys the Democrats' bullshit anymore. You actually have to do things for the younger generation before they vote for you. It's crazy. It's crazy. So, yeah, there's our censorship news for today. Kind of. Gotta love Gen Z. Yeah, true. Gen Z is finally like, yeah, I'm not just going to vote Democrat because you told me that Trump's worse. There are still some TikTok influencers that are simping for Biden, and the Democrats like Harry. Yeah, and that guy, when I know that's one of the guys who I know, Harry. And when Biden got elected, he immediately launched missiles at Syria, and this guy, the typical Democrat, aka Harry, made a video defending him. Supporting Biden's missile strikes in the Middle East. And then I went to make a video criticizing him for that, and he had blocked me. He preemptively blocked me because he knew once he started defending the Democrats doing imperialism, that I was going to call it out. because he was only against Trump, whereas I was against imperialism no matter who's doing it, right? So he pretended to be my ally while Trump was in office, and then started taking money from Biden and blocked me, and so I couldn't criticize him defending Biden launching missiles at children in Syria. So hilarious stuff. Hilarious stuff. These people are simps. I have no respect for it.
The Western military,
in relation to social media censorship, this is a video someone sent us on the Discord. Shout out to the Midwestern Marx Discord. You can find the link tree, or find a link to join our Discord in our link tree. But someone sent this. The journalist Seymour Hersh had his report about the Nord Stream pipeline censored on Facebook. So Facebook, of course, got caught censoring the Hunter Biden laptop story during the last election, censoring information to try and help the Biden administration win, which the Democrats justified by saying, you know, we needed to do it to stop Trump or whatever, blah, 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 blah. All the censorship is to stop Trump and stop Putin. So now Facebook is censoring former New York Times correspondent Seymour Hersh and his very detailed and very important article explaining exactly how the Nord Stream pipeline was sabotaged. So this is just new levels of censorship, even unexpected from the likes of Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook.
Alliance, NATO, is waging a new Cold War against Russia. And as that new Cold War escalates, we see more and more censorship and tight Western government control of the media. The censorship is now expanding not only to alternative media outlets and small independent journalists, but even some of the world's most renowned journalists, specifically the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh, one of the most famous investigative journalists on earth, is now being censored by Facebook over his report on the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. In September 2022, the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up. They were sabotaged. The Nord Stream pipelines were two different series of two pipelines for a total of 4 pipelines that delivered natural gas from Russia to Germany. This was a European project. It was not just a Russian project. I really need to stress this point. Half of the project was owned by Russia's state-owned gas company, but the other half was owned by multiple European companies, including...
That is a good point, that it was partially a European project, because by going along with the US and NATO, these European countries have basically sabotaged their own economy. They've decided to just be cucked to the US, and Russia, where they were getting the Nord Stream pipeline, where they were getting like 50% of their energy that's needed to power the entire economy, they've just cut that off and started buying natural gas much more expensively and much more inefficiently from the US because it has to be shipped over in boats. So it makes no sense. It's them shooting themselves in the foot to go along with NATO's proxy war against Russia to try and isolate Russia. As the rest of the world seems to be siding with Russia and China and forging closer economic ties with Russia and China, moving away from the West. So the West is now basically self-isolating and destroying their own economies, which is causing a lot of uprisings in Europe. A lot of people who can no longer heat their houses or can no longer pay for food because of inflation. And they're not happy about it. Just look at what's going on in France. The EU is just a vassal, essentially, at this point.
Those in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. So the destruction of these pipelines was...
Sorry, I just want to say this too. It's sad how pathetic they are. For real, like, you know, I give pump-up speeches to the American working class a lot. Like, how are we letting our government represent us this way? How are we letting these pampered, bloated parasites like Bill Gates and these military-industrial complex capitalists run our country and send our children to fight and die in wars as our infrastructure crumbles at home? You know, spend our tax dollars on weapons for Ukraine instead of jobs here at home. Like, how are we allowing this? But same thing goes for the European countries and the NATO member countries. Like, have some pride. Stand up Seize control of your government from these oligarchs who are destroying your country at the behest of the West. They're just acting as simps to the US and allowing your economies to be destroyed for a proxy war against Russia that no working class person in the world cares about. Right? It's just the Western multinationals trying to hang on to their power and hegemony. Screw that. Let's have trade relations with Russia and China. Right? Let's put our economy first. Let's put our own people first and their livelihood first. Let's not allow these weapons contractors and oil oligarchs who dominate our governments to continue doing this, to continue destroying our economies and putting people in worse and worse and worse conditions. Have some pride. Stand the hell up and seize your government. Don't be cucked by the United States. And U.S. workers, don't be cucked by the military-industrial complex that controls the United States.
Essentially a terror attack on civilian infrastructure and significant energy infrastructure for Europe. The world-renowned journalist Seymour Hersh, one of the world's most respected journalists, reported that the pipelines were blown up by the U.S. government in an operation overseen by the Joe Biden administration, and specifically the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the Assistant Secretary of State, the third in command of the State Department, Victoria Nuland, who is a hardline anti-Russia hawk and was involved in organizing the...
I actually love Victoria Nuland, right? Because she'll say things out loud that people call conspiracy theories. I mean, this has happened a lot. Like when Angela Merkel said that, you know, the Minsk agreements in 2014 were never intended to be peace agreements. And it was just a way for NATO to build up military in Ukraine so that they could eventually attack Russia. Right. And people, even though Angela Merkel said that out loud, people will still call it a conspiracy theory. It's the same with Victoria Nuland. Right. She had a leaked phone call with Jeffrey Pyatt where they were planning out what they wanted to do with the Ukrainian government. And then there was a leaked speaking engagement where she said that U.S. NGOs have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars in Ukraine to try and control the politics and try and foment a coup in 2014. She said these things out loud. You can look them up. They're in the movie Ukraine on Fire. You can see videos of her saying these things, but people will still call them conspiracy theories. So when I debate Vish about Ukraine, I think I'm just going to have a whole bunch of Victoria Nuland videos pulled up. So if he says that's a conspiracy theory, I'll be like, well, here's a video of the U.S. government official in charge of our foreign policy in Ukraine saying this, saying that it's true. So how do you call that a conspiracy? Who knows? Vish still will, though. He'll say whatever he needs to defend the empire.
The 2014 coup that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected government and installed a pro-Western regime. According to Seymour Hersh, again, one of the world's most respected journalists, the operation was overseen by the U.S. military, which had professional divers who put large amounts of explosives on the pipelines during NATO military exercises in the Baltic Sea in June 2022. And then in September, those explosives were blown up with the help of Norway, another member of NATO. Now, if you go to Facebook and you try to share the link to Seymour Hersh's report on the Nord Stream...
This is true in relation to what we were saying earlier about the European states being cucked by the U.S. Someone was like, you know, in this phone, I think it was Jeffrey Pyatt in the phone call with Victoria Nuland was like, you know, the EU isn't going to like completely cutting off Russia economically. They get a lot of energy, gas, and oil from Russia. And she literally just goes, fuck the EU. That's a real phone call. Watch the movie Ukraine on Fire if you haven't watched it yet. But people in Europe, are you going to let the Americans talk about you this way? Are you going to continue to do the bidding, the imperialist warmongering bidding of these oligarchs who literally said, fuck the EU when they were confronted with economic concerns that your people may have? Stand up to these people. Take your government back. Make it a government of the people.
Attacks. Facebook tries to prevent you from posting it. Originally, Facebook censored it in help of Norway, another member
Play this
of NATO.
again because I kind of interrupted
Now,
it.
if you go to Facebook and you try to share the link to Seymour Hersh's report on the Nord
Fact check. Oh my gosh, it's just what I was saying earlier. It's just what I was saying. They always say fact check, and then they tell you something that's wrong, right? Fact check, and then they spread misinformation. But because it's Facebook, because it's some big established corporation, we're supposed to believe that their fact checks are true, right? It says fact check. It must be based in fact. No. It pretty much nowadays in corporate media, anything that says fact check, you can pretty much assume that it's the opposite, that it's a lie.
Stream attacks. Facebook tries to prevent you from posting it. Originally, Facebook censored it entirely. If you posted the article, it would prevent you from being able to read it and would blur it and put a message that said false information checked by independent fact checkers. By the
Independent fact checkers. Fact check is their favorite word nowadays. Anybody share something that's true that makes the US empire look bad, just say it's false and then put fact check in front of it. Like in that USA Today article we just covered, their fact check basically confirmed what people were saying was true. Yet USA Today was trying to say, no, this isn't true. We did a fact check. But there's never any information, there's never any substance to prove their fact check. It's always just them saying, their ideological position. And anything that goes against their ideological position is unfactual.
By the way, they're not independent. They're funded by the government of Norway, which is a NATO member state. But I'll come back to that thought later. In response to criticism, Facebook slightly changed that policy, and now there's a pop-up message, and Facebook encourages you not to post it. And Facebook writes, quote, "Before you share this content, you might want to know there's additional reporting from Faktisk, which is a Norwegian fact-checking website. It's backed by the Norwegian government, by the way. So this is basically government censorship." And
another one, literally a website designed to fact-check things, but in reality, it's designed to spread propaganda and lies. Fact-check is the new conspiracy theory. Facts.
Facebook writes, "Pages and websites that repeatedly publish or share false news." So they're claiming that Seymour Hersh's report is false news. And Facebook says that if you share this report, you will see your overall distribution reduced and restricted in other ways. So Facebook is telling you essentially that if you share this report from the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Seymour Hersh, Facebook will censor you. And not just this post, but other posts that you publish in the future. So this is one of the world's most popular social media outlets telling you that you can't publish information that the US government doesn't like and other Western governments don't like, or you will be censored. Now, if you click on the link that Facebook...
And there were a lot of people when Mark Zuckerberg went on Joe Rogan's show and said, yeah, the FBI asked us to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story. There were a lot of people who defended that. Right? They were like, oh, well, that story was a risk to national security, right? People who think that the Democrats are so much better than the Republicans, that we need to always back the Democrats because Trump is so uniquely evil that we need to do whatever we can to stop him. There are people who consider themselves leftists or progressives or whatever, who are saying, yeah, it's okay that the FBI got Facebook to censor a story because it's a story that I personally wanted censored, a story that might have helped Trump. Right? This is why we need to be against this government censorship at every turn, right? Because they're just going to use it for whatever's in their own interest, right? They're never going to censor things for the greater good. Like, that's never going to happen. That's not how the government works. We know the government's a dictatorship of capital. So they're going to censor anything that threatens imperialism or threatens capital, even if it's from a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Right? So this is why we were against the censorship of Hunter Biden's laptop too. Plus, Hunter Biden's laptop had a lot of interesting information on it that people should have had access to. If that affects the elections, oh well. Right? Sometimes that doesn't mean that we should bar any information that hurts one of the bourgeois political parties.
Facebook provides, and you go to this.
And I just love, like, they always say we need to censor this information to protect democracy too. Like, we need to censor this information, otherwise Trump might win the election, right? So we need to protect democracy. You need to censor the information that people are allowed to see so that you can control who wins the election for democracy? What the hell do you think democracy is? What does the word democracy mean to you? You're censoring information to control an election that people are voting in for democracy. Controlling the election is anti-democratic. Censoring information to influence an election is anti-democratic, right? Just because it helps your side, just because you don't like Trump and something helps your side doesn't mean it's for democracy, right? You're just blind to the fact that your side is also imperialist and anti-democratic.
Norwegian government-funded fact-checking website. Of course, I have auto-translate on here because I don't speak Norwegian, so this is the Google auto-translate to English. It goes to an article that accuses Seymour Hersh of making mistakes in his report on the Nord Stream sabotage. They are very minor, basic mistakes. So for instance, he posted a map with his article, and they claim that the map mislabeled Norwegian military bases, and he referred to Norwegian air bases as a naval base. So very minor details that are distracting from the main point, which is not about where Norwegian military bases are located. It's about how these pipelines were blown up. And the article provides no compelling evidence or any other alternative explanation for how the pipelines were blown up. Instead, it nitpicks very minor details, and it also just says, it says very clearly, there has been no shortage of theories about who is behind the explosions, the attacks. It notes that the governments of Denmark, Sweden, and Germany have refused to provide information. And by the way, members of the German parliament, including from the leftist Die Linke party, have called for information, and the German government refuses to publicly release information on this. So instead, this Norwegian fact-checking website says, could it be a pro-Ukrainian sabotage group which operated from a rented sailboat? Do mysterious ships sighted in the area have anything to do with the case? So here, they're just quoting propaganda from the New York Times. The corporate media in the US, led by the New York Times, has published multiple ridiculous stories trying to blame the destruction of these Nord Stream pipelines instead on what they refer to as a pro-Ukrainian group.
Same old playbook to smear a credible journalist. Yeah, and being on TikTok, it gives me access to people who like consider themselves leftists, progressives, but who aren't super educated on Marxism or just super educated on what's going on in the world, like people in our chat are. So there are a lot of people who follow my account because they, you know, see it as a socialist or a left-wing account, who are calling Seymour Hersh a conspiracy theorist, who will say things like, yeah, Seymour Hersh used to be really good, but now he's drifting towards conspiracy theories, right? Because there are young, like Gen Z leftists, young Gen Z would-be socialists, would-be Marxists who fall for this stuff because they're not used to it. They don't realize that, you know, how much of a propaganda outlet, how much of a propaganda machine the media really is, how willing to lie and smear people the media really is. So they buy into some of these claims just because they're being repeated over and over and over and over again. So, yeah, it's terrible to see the effects and see that there are some young leftists who don't think Seymour Hersh is credible anymore because of a few reports from propagandists who want to censor his work. But it's wild. It's wild that Facebook would just openly censor a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And I mean, there have been so many important stories that have been exposed by Seymour Hersh or that have been released by Seymour Hersh. And none of them, all of them have been proven true. And with time, we've only found out more and more how true they are. Like with Abu Ghraib, right? He showed that the U.S. had this torture campaign, this prison in Iraq that they converted to just a torture chamber, where they would take people and say, tell us that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and torture people until they said that, which is what the U.S. wanted to hear because that gave them justification for the invasion, which is why torture doesn't even work. It allows the torture, the torturer can just get the person being tortured to say whatever they want. But Seymour Hersh revealed this, right? And with time, we got more and more and more leaked documents, leaked information that proved it was true and that it was overseen by Donald Rumsfeld the same way that Seymour Hersh reported, right? But now that it's Ukraine, we're supposed to believe that this is a conspiracy theory, that Seymour Hersh is no longer telling the truth, that he's now a puppet of Putin or whatever. It goes back to my favorite quote, my greatest quote of all time, perhaps. Everybody's an anti-imperialist in hindsight, right? Everybody can look back at the Iraq War and Abu Ghraib and Seymour Hersh's reporting about Abu Ghraib. They could say, yeah, he was right about that, right? The Iraq War was terrible. The Iraq War was bad. The Iraq War was based on lies. We know that after 20 years of leaked documents and leaked information. But the Ukraine war, no. Seymour Hersh is lying about that. The U.S. government's telling the truth about that. That proxy war is not based on lies. That's all Russia's fault. It's absurd. Like, you don't think the U.S. government's still lying. You don't think Seymour Hersh still has connections within the U.S. government and he's still telling the truth, right? How are so many people falling for it again? And it's because of the corporate media machine, right? It's because the corporate media machine is beating the war drums and calling anybody who's critical of the proxy war in Ukraine a Russian propagandist, somebody who supports Russia eating babies or whatever. So that people are hesitant to be critical of the intervention, the imperialist project going on right now, right in front of our eyes, right? If you can criticize Iraq, but you can't criticize the proxy war in Ukraine, you are being an anti-imperialist in hindsight, right? You need to be able to recognize when an imperialist project is going on right in front of you. And you need to be able to discern the lies from the truth when those lies are being told to you. Not 20 years later, when a bunch of leaked documents come out and we find out, or that everybody knows what NATO is currently doing in Ukraine, that NATO has never wanted to do anything in East Europe except for attack Russia and provoke Russia. Make America critically think again. Please. Please. Everyone's an anti-imperialist when it's Russia bombing. So yeah, speaking of the war in Ukraine, this is the video I wanted to react to. We're now getting some historian videos about Ukraine, which should be interesting. Some of the most popular videos that we've done on the Midwestern Marx channel have been our videos criticizing the Oversimplified YouTube channel, which is a YouTube channel that does videos very similar to this. They're animated, narrated, scripted, really well done, really well produced, which gives them an air of authority, right? Which gives you a sense that what you're watching is truthful or what you're watching is factual. Of course, if you're a Marxist dialectical materialist, you're going to notice a lot of errors in their reporting. But if you're somebody who's just trying to learn history for the first time, just going on YouTube to Google a historical event or try and figure out what's going on in the world, these are the kind of videos that are going to pop up, right? And because they're well produced, they have this air of authority to where people are going to believe them. So that's why I think it's important to deconstruct these videos. That's why I think our videos deconstructing the Oversimplified series have gotten so popular, because people oftentimes just believe these things at face value. So when somebody deconstructs them and criticizes them, it has a lot of value for people. So yeah, this is Armchair Historian. Does a lot of videos like these. Pretty much every video they've ever put out, I would have a lot of criticisms of. But this is their video on the war in Ukraine summarized.
From widespread destruction to one of the largest refugee crises in the world, consequences of the war in Ukraine have reverberated globally. Today, we're going to delve into the 2022 events from the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian, and this is the War in Ukraine 2022.
I agree with everything you said so far. Obviously, you just said basic stuff, except for that it's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is, but you have to throw NATO in there. You have to throw the U.S. in there, right? Because where is Ukraine getting their guns? Where is Ukraine getting their weaponry? It's all from the U.S. and NATO, right? And obviously, this war wouldn't have happened without the U.S. coup in 2014, but I'm sure armchair historian would say that the coup is a conspiracy theory. But it's absolutely a conflict between NATO and Russia because the conflict would have never happened, or it would have ended years ago, or ended a long time ago if it wasn't for NATO and the US funneling weapons into Ukraine.
Our historical strategy game, Fire and Maneuver, has left early access and is available now. Check it out with the link below.
Should I play their strategy game?
In order to understand the origins of the war, it is crucial to examine the events that triggered the Ukrainian-Russian crisis, starting with the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of hostilities in Donbass. In early 2014, the Euromaidan protests led to the ousting of Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. Soon after, Yanukovych fled to Russia. A wave of pro-Russian unrest erupted in eastern and southern Ukraine.
The pro-Russian unrest was going on the whole time that Euromaidan was going on, because people recognized that it was a U.S. coup effort. And we were talking earlier about Victoria Nuland and the things that she has openly admitted, right? There's a video of her at a speaking engagement that's in the movie Ukraine on Fire saying that we spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to create Euromaidan, to influence Ukrainian politics and create this color revolution, this uprising that ousted the government and put a more pro-US government in power. Right? So this has been admitted by Victoria Nuland, one of the major players in Ukraine, right? The person crafting, I believe she was the US ambassador to Ukraine, so crafting US foreign policy in Ukraine. She admitted spending millions and millions of dollars to create Euromaidan and influence Ukrainian politics. For any historian, that should be a big deal, right? That should be something worth mentioning. If a country is spending millions and millions of dollars to create a protest that eventually overthrows another country's government, that's something worth mentioning when you talk about that event. But they just gloss over that. They totally miss that. They don't even bring it up. Why? Because it goes against their narrative. It goes against their narrative that this was just a natural uprising that happened in Ukraine and not an undemocratic coup where the U.S. funneled money into extremist groups who made the protests violent and turned it into an actual overthrow of the government. Also, Crimea wasn't annexed. Crimea voted to join Russia, and even Western polling numbers had like over 80 to 90% of people in Crimea voting to join Russia, or 80 to 90% of them wanted to join Russia. Crimea was only given to Ukraine by Khrushchev, about 70 years ago. So it makes sense that a lot of people there would have an attachment to Russia, especially when they're watching this Nazi coup government backed by the U.S. take over Ukraine. Of course, they wanted to get away from that mess. But if you tell the truth, if you talk about all those facts that I just mentioned, it makes it really difficult to portray Russia as the evil aggressors, right? And it makes it really easy to see NATO as the evil aggressors or the provocateurs of this conflict. And of course, we know the goal of armchair historian here is to make you think Russia bad, Russia evil, Russia aggressors. NATO good, NATO helping Ukraine, NATO supporting democracy.
Simultaneously, unmarked Russian troops, which had already been stationed in military bases within Crimea, took control of government buildings, strategic sites, and infrastructure. In March, Moscow would hold a highly contentious referendum, which led to Crimea being annexed by.
So I see someone in the chat saying, where is Crimea? I was going to pull up a map, but here's the map. It's like right off Ukraine, but, it's almost like an island. And then here's Russia over here. So it's like in between them. And like I said, it belonged to Russia, and then Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine. So good question. It's always good to try and know the geography of these areas that we're talking about, because it helps the politics make more sense if you understand, where everything's located.
This referendum, which led to
My favorite politics professor would be proud of me. He always made us do map quizzes to figure out wherever all the countries are. So he would be glad that I'm encouraging y'all to study geography.
Crimea being annexed by Russia. The results of this referendum were not recognized by the international community. Soon after, armed pro-Russian separatists
The international community, meaning bourgeois international law, created since its inception at the end of World War II by the U.S. All right, so they'll just leave it at the international community, though. They won't mention all the countries who did recognize the vote in Crimea, but because the U.S. and their allies didn't recognize it. So we'll just call that the international community and call it good. Propaganda.
seized government buildings in Donbass and proclaimed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The separatists received considerable seized government buildings in Donbass annexed by Russia. The results of this referendum were not recognized by the international community. Soon after, armed pro-Russian separatists seized government buildings in Donbass and proclaimed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics.
Why did they do that, armchair historian? Why did these separatists want to form their own independent republics? Was it because the US coup put a bunch of Nazis in power? Is it because groups like the Azov Battalion were actually brought into the Ukrainian military? Groups who are anti-Russian and wanted to ban the Russian language and prey Stepan Bandera, which the Ukrainian Nazi government did. They banned the Russian language and made Stepan Bandera the Hitler collaborator during World War II, Ukrainian nationalist, godfather of Ukrainian nationalism, made him a national hero. And then after the Azov Battalion and all these paramilitaries became part of the actual Ukrainian National Guard and had access to the Ukrainian military weapons, they started shelling the homes of people in the Donbass. Right? Between 2014 and 2022, 14,000 people were killed in the Donbass. And yes, some of those were Ukrainian, but a ton of them were women and children and civilians in the Donbass region. So a bunch of them took up arms, and that's what he's calling a separatist group who just seized government buildings for no reason. But they declared themselves independent republics because there was an undemocratic Nazi government installed in Ukraine who started blowing up their houses with artillery. And to just gloss over that and not even mention that it happened is to smear the people of the Donbass as, illegal separatists, and to totally just conceal what their actual plight was, what was actually going on, and why they actually wanted to declare themselves independent republics. And if you don't believe me, please, 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 please go on Twitter or Facebook or wherever and follow Dan Kovalik, a professor and prolific author who spent a lot of time in the Donbass talking to their people, right? Talking to their people about how their homes were shelled and how they were attacked after the coup in 2014. Armchair historian could benefit a lot from listening to those interviews and actually talking to the people of the Donbass before he smears them as evil. And follow the journalism of Wyatt Reed, who was also in the Donbass. And actually right now, Dan Kovalik is in Crimea talking to people about the referendum and about the intervention. So if you want to hear from people who are actually there, from people who are actually in this region, follow Dan Kovalik and Wyatt Reed. If you want to hear a bunch of Western bullshit smearing the people in this region who are fighting for their lives against Western imperialist aggression and coup governments and coup dictatorships, listen to Armchair Historian. But your brain is going to turn to mush if you do.
The separatists received considerable covert support from Russia, and Ukrainian attempts to fully retake the separatist-held areas were unsuccessful. The fighting would continue in 2015. Attempts to fully retake the separatist-held areas were unsuccessful. The fight.
See, they weren't shelling civilian homes. They were just trying to retake these areas taken by the separatists, right? And if it was only a handful of separatists who seized government buildings, why wasn't the Ukrainian military able to take these areas back? It's almost like these whole countries, or the vast majority of people in the Donbass, wanted to be independent republics, right? You wouldn't be able to defend your country if only like 5% of the people in it were separatists and seized the government, right? The reason Ukraine wasn't able to take this region back is because this region doesn't want to be part of Ukraine anymore.
Would continue in 2015, especially around Donetsk, Luhansk, and Mariupol, with the separatists intent on gaining control of the oblasts. Still, the front lines would soon become largely static. As a result, in February 2015, Russia and Ukraine signed the Minsk II agreements in a bid to end the conflict. Although the agreements were never fully implemented, the Donbass war settled into a violent but effectively frozen conflict, with many brief ceasefires, no lasting peace, and few changes in territorial control. A major escalation would happen 3 years later, as the
constant shelling. Yeah, there was no change of territorial control, but the people of the Donbass were living under constant fear that they would have artillery shells come and destroy their homes or destroy their public areas. Because that, there weren't any changes in territory, no, but the Azov battalion and these other neo-Nazi paramilitaries, who after the U.S. coup in 2014 actually became part of the Ukrainian military, became part of their actual government, which would be like the U.S. adding the KKK to the National Guard, literally. After that, they just kept launching missiles and launching artillery shells into the Donbass. Which, what do you think? Like, if you took an extremist group in the U.S., like the KKK, and you made them part of the military, yeah, they would start attacking minority groups. They would start attacking black people, right? These are anti-Russian people who hate Russia, Ukrainian ethno-nationalists. So yeah, they started shelling and launching missiles into the Donbass, the place where you have a lot of ethnic Russians and cultural Russians and Russian speakers. But Americans Americans are so disconnected from this. They're like, no, the Azov battalion kicked all the neo-Nazis out, after the U.S. coup and after they became part of the military. Like, no, they were founded as a neo-Nazi paramilitary. That's their whole thing. Their whole thing is Nazism. That is what they are. That is what they support. They didn't just kick the neo-Nazis out as soon as the U.S. started giving them money and guns. Fucking how naive can you actually be to believe that? It's insane that that's the real U.S. narrative that people believe. People who call themselves historians believe.
The Russian Coast Guard fired upon and captured 3 Ukrainian Navy vessels after they attempted to transit from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov. The Kerch Strait incident flared up tensions, and martial law was briefly declared by Ukraine in fears that a full-scale war would soon break out between the two countries, but new conflict did not come. Nevertheless, as soon as Crimea was annexed, Moscow had begun to integrate the regions under their control, issuing hundreds of thousands of Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens. This violent status quo continued for...
How dare they? How dare they? Did they just say this violent status quo? The status quo is violent because Russia gave their citizens a bunch of passports? I'm pretty sure the violence is happening because you made a neo-Nazi battalion part of the military, and they're attacking all the minorities in the country. But what do I know?
For years, until the beginning of 2021, when Russia built up a large military presence near its border with Ukraine, including from neighboring Belarus. The Kremlin denied any ill will regarding these troop concentrations, stating that they were in the area to perform military exercises.
Where was the U.S. army? Or where was the Ukrainian army amassing? Right on the border of Russia and Ukraine. So Russia was amassing military forces on their border, yes, in response to the NATO forces who were amassing on their border. And Ukraine, Russia had said, if you make Ukraine a part of NATO, we will intervene. We will do something. They warned them about this multiple times. And the Donbass requested that Russia do something about this 10 times before Russia actually did over the course of 7 years or so. So instead of adding Ukraine to NATO, the U.S. just kept training up NATO troops. Troops are NATO interoperable, which means that the troops who the U.S. was amassing on Russia's border in Ukraine could have done missions with or instantly, been compatible with French NATO troops and NATO troops in the UK and NATO troops in Germany. Once these troops are trained in NATO interoperability, they can go do missions with NATO troops anywhere in the world, and they'll all use the same language, and they'll be able to communicate with each other and have the same training. So the U.S. didn't add Ukraine to NATO, but they were making troops NATO interoperable and lining them up on the border. And now we know from Angela Merkel, because she admitted it, that the goal of this was always, always, always to build up military forces, which the U.S. could use to attack Russia. Right? Angela Merkel straight up said that the 2014 proposed Minsk agreements, peace agreements, the U.S. never had any plans to follow it. NATO never had any plans to follow it. Their whole goal was to buy time so they could build up military forces along the border and then attack Russia. So despite that, despite the fact that we know that now, this armchair historian guy is only going to bring up the Russian troops. He's literally only bringing up one side of the issue while just not talking about the other side. Russia was amassing troops on the border, clearly threatening Ukraine. Let's completely ignore the fact that NATO and the U.S., a foreign country who's not even anywhere near this region, was amassing troops right on Russia's border. And Russia was aligning their troops in a defensive posture. See, but why tell the truth when we can just completely isolate, half of this map? Half of this map doesn't exist. Let's just look at what Russia's doing so that we can pretend they're doing it for no reason or pretend they're doing it just to be aggressive. I mean, what a blatant lie, right? There's no way you could actually look into this issue and know the history of what was going on, right? And still say this stuff unless you know that you're lying and you're just trying to lie on behalf of your donors or whoever.
Nonetheless, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused Ukraine of infringing on the rights of Russian speakers and used Ukrainian collaboration with the Germans in the Second World War to accuse some in the Kyiv government of supporting neo-Nazis.
There are neo-Nazis who are part of their National Guard. The Azov Battalion became part of the Ukrainian National Guard. There are political parties like Right Sector who are openly ethno-nationalist and neo-Nazi who were at the center of the 2014 Euromaidan protests and who received tons of funding and political support from the United States. Right? These are people who have swastika tattoos, who call themselves Nazis and supporters of Stepan Bandera, who are rising to positions of political power and military power in Ukraine after the U.S. funneled millions of dollars into Ukraine. And we know that the U.S. has a history of supporting Nazis when it's convenient for them. Just look at fascists. Just look at the Contras in Nicaragua. But you're going to say it's Russian propaganda that there was anybody leaning towards neo-Nazism in the Ukrainian government? Quit lying. Quit lying. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. If you want people, tell the truth of what's going on and then let people decide for themselves. But that's not the idea. The idea isn't to give people the facts and let them decide for themselves. It's to omit any facts that go against the U.S. NATO narrative. And it's so obvious to anybody who knows the actual facts. I don't care if you're critical of Russia. I don't care if you say that, I don't support the Russian invasion. I think it was, Putin acted irrationally. It escalated things. It was not the right response for Russia. Sure. But don't lie and say that there were no neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian government when there were literal neo-Nazi militias being filtered into the Ukrainian military. Don't blatantly lie to defend fucking Nazis.
Putin argued that Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood, rather that Lenin had created it by carving a Soviet republic out of Russian imperial land, and that Stalin and
kind of a fair critique of Lenin. That's all I'll say.
Khrushchev expanded Ukraine after the Second World War. Putin continued to criticize the enlargement of NATO publicly and demanded that Ukraine be barred from ever joining. Alongside this, he also demanded the removal of multinational forces stationed in NATO's Eastern European member states. These demands were rejected by NATO, and Ukraine, under US influence, continues to seek more integration with the West.
And imagine if the shoe was on the other foot. Imagine if Russia was amassing troops and training troops on the U.S.-Canada border. And the US said Canada cannot join this Russian military alliance because we're afraid that Russia's going to use Canada to attack us because they're amassing troops right on our border. Right? What would the US do? The US would have invaded Canada yesterday. They would have seen one US troop on the US-Canada border and freaking launched nukes at Canada and Russia simultaneously. If any country, China, Russia, whoever, did to the US what we do to them, the U.S. would respond nuclearly, with nuclear weapons. The U.S. would respond with an utter meltdown if Russia overthrew the Canadian government and started amassing troops on their border. But we're supposed to believe that Russia are the dictators because they said, don't let Ukraine join NATO. NATO, which was supposedly an alliance to stop the spread of the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore.
Creating an objective documentary on current events can be a daunting task for creators who want to convey the facts without any sort of bias towards one side or the other. Thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, we didn't need to spend hours skimming through headlines and copy looking for impartial coverage in researching for this video. Ground News is a website and app that combines articles from thousands of local and national outlets in one place.
Oh, there you go. They just use this app. This app finds the State Department narrative for you and just feeds it to you and then calls it unbiased. So you don't even have to do any work. What a great way to propagandize people who are trying to get into the news and trying to get into being informed, right? Oh, just this app will find what's biased and what's not for you. And then that app just feeds you State Department propaganda. What a clever little trick.
Yes. On February 21st, Putin announced that the Russian government would diplomatically recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The same evening, Putin directed that Russian troops deploy into Donbass in what Russia referred to as a peacekeeping mission. In response, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky ordered a 30-day nationwide state of emergency and the mobilization of all reservists. On the morning of February 24th, Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, air and missile strikes were conducted across the country. This was followed shortly thereafter by a large ground invasion along multiple fronts. Zelensky declared martial law and a general mobilization of all male Ukrainian citizens between 18 and 60 who were banned from leaving the country. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus toward Kyiv, a northeastern front toward Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Donbass.
Zelensky also banned all opposition parties and opposition media. That was the first thing that they said that was even slightly critical of Zelensky. Like, he banned people from leaving the country and, drafted them to fight Russia. But it's framed as, well, Russia invaded, so he kind of had to. When, Ukraine is being portrayed in the West as a liberal democracy versus Russia as this authoritarian fascist state or whatever. When Ukraine not only has actual fascists in their military, but they banned all opposition parties. They banned communist parties, and a whole bunch of communists have been imprisoned by the Ukrainian, the SPD, basically Ukraine's version of the CIA or the secret police, have been banning any and all opposition. So definitely not a liberal democracy.
Many expected the invasion to be a short affair that would go in Russia's favor, with even the Americans offering Zelensky evacuation. But the Ukrainians resisted. The Northern Front, which was supposed to be a dash to Kyiv to topple the government, stalled after initially offering Zelensky evacuation. A southern front from Crimea and a southeastern front from Donbass. Many expected the invasion to be a short affair that would go in Russia's favor, with even the Americans offering Zelensky evacuation, but the Ukrainians resisted.
I wanted to hear who offered him evacuation. The Americans offered him evacuation. Gotcha. I think they did think the military operation was going to be shorter than it was, but I don't know if Russia expected NATO to go as all out as they did and push this Ukraine's going to fight down to the last Ukrainian narrative while just continuing to dump weapons and block any effort to create a peace agreement. I don't think Russia expected the West to go all out in this proxy war as much as they did. And I didn't either. That's probably the area where my early analysis failed the most, was I thought this was just going to be like a minor special military operation that the West was going to call an invasion. But, it has escalated a great degree since then, but, mostly because of NATO and the West, of course. But
The Northern Front, which was supposed to be a dash to Kyiv to topple the government, stalled after initial gains. A daring airborne assault to capture the Antonov airport also failed after the damaging of the ensuing battle, which the Russians won, rendered the airport inoperable.
And this is difficult because I'm not I listen to pretty much everything that Scott Ritter puts out, who is a military analyst and who does go into the details of, military analysis, but this isn't my area of expertise. But from my perspective, or from what I know, Russia has been taking their time and sort of playing the slow game, but it wasn't like they just wanted to march into Ukraine and seize Kiev right away. They wanted to secure the Donbass regions first and make their way and hopefully sign a peace agreement before they had to go all the way to Kiev. But of course, NATO has blocked any attempt at a peace agreement. And then the U.S. media keeps saying, Russia just wants to seize all of Ukraine, but they've been unable to because of the heroic fighting forces of the Azov battalion and the Ukrainians. So they've been trying to portray like Russia wants to seize the country, but they've been unable to because Ukraine has done so good and has fought so honorably. And I don't think that's really accurate, but, I can't go into the details of the military strategy because that is not my area of expertise.
Russians would be halted at the suburbs of Kyiv during the month-long battles of Irpin, Hostomel, and Bucha. Russian logistical issues were evidently seen, as their columns stretched for kilometers in a traffic jam. The Ukrainian military quickly took advantage of this vulnerability, ambushing Russian vehicles and further worsening their supply situation. By April, Russian command had realized that their offensive had run out of steam and decided to withdraw from the Kyiv front to redeploy elsewhere. Ukrainians later discovered that a number of civilians were executed in Bucha when Russian forces left the area. Russian fortunes.
Everybody knows about Bucha at this point. Everybody knows what that was. And I don't know what I'm allowed to say without getting banned. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the word flag false. But that's what Bucha was.
Were different in the South.
It was I'll say it was U.S. atrocity propaganda. Right? It was the U.S. trying to make it look like Russia had committed the worst crime imaginable. Like the same as the incubator babies that they accused Iraqi troops of taking babies and putting them on the floor, or taking them out of incubators and leaving them to die, which justified the Gulf War, where the U.S. would bomb Iraq to a pre-industrial state and sanction them, which killed 500,000 children in order to help children and help babies. So they use atrocity propaganda to justify the worst atrocities possible. That was what Bucha is. Look what Russia did. Look at this atrocity that they did. Let's send more money to Ukrainian neo-Nazis so that we can fight these atrocities. When in reality, the U.S. and NATO have been prolonging the war, leading to more deaths on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, doing nothing to prevent atrocities, while taking atrocities and blowing them up on the news to try and use them as justification for warfare.
With the recapture of the North Crimean Canal on the day the invasion started. The canal, which had previously supplied 85% of Crimea's drinking and irrigation water, was blocked by Ukraine after its Russian annexation. As such, its capture represented an important objective for Moscow. 2 days later, the siege of Mariupol began as the Russian army linked east with the separatist-held Donbass. Russian forces would also alarm the international community by attacking the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, stoking fears of a potential nuclear catastrophe. At the time of making this video, the power plant remains under Russian control. Russian troops would also attack from Crimea toward the west, with many theorizing that Russia wanted to push to Odessa and link up with the pro-Russian separatist region of Transnistria in Moldova. It was on this front that the first major Ukrainian city, Kherson, fell to the Russian army. The fall of Kherson was accompanied by the capture of Antonovsky Bridge, holding this strategic crossing over the Dnieper.
That was the first time they mentioned Odessa, by the way, which is where we now know that a bunch of pro-Maidan, pro-coup snipers fired upon civilians, killing dozens of them, and then blamed it on Russia despite no evidence. And a bunch of scholarly analyses have now been conducted, reviewing all of the evidence and determining that it was the U.S.-backed Maidan forces that were shooting civilians. in order to escalate the protests into an actual violent overthrow of the government. But yeah, I just forgot to bring that up. We just published an article about it too. And wait, no, sorry, was that Odessa where that happened, or was Odessa where the trade union building was burned? I might be mixing up my stories, but either way, two of the major events, the Ukrainian fascist burning trade unionists alive, that was in Odessa, yeah. And the Ukrainian fascists firing on civilians with snipers in order to escalate the 2014 protests into an actual violent coup and seize power of the government and filter Nazis into the actual Ukrainian military. None of this was brought up by this video. All of this was glossed over because, just like everything else they're saying in this video, or I mean everything else they're neglecting to say in this video, it makes the US and NATO look bad. So if we're propagandists, we're not even allowed to talk about it. It's all Russian propaganda. The truth is Russian propaganda. Important events that led to the conflict, Russian propaganda.
River would allow Russian forces to attack the important junction city of...
The sniper was Maidan Square. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And they were Georgian snipers. Yes, there have been, like I said, Ivan Kachanovsky, I think is the guy's name, has published a ton of scholarly analyses of the sniper events. And then Odessa was the fire. And we just published an article on Midwestern Marx about that. And actually, I turned it into a video too. I made a video summary of the Odessa fires, which is why I was getting it mixed up with the sniper attack. I had just been reading about it. But
Mykolaiv. The Russians attempted to take the city but were repelled, stopping their advance toward Odessa. In the east, the Russian army attempted to capture Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. While Kharkiv is less than 35 kilometers from the Russian border, the Ukrainians put up strong resistance. Subsequently, the city was continuously bombarded and shelled as Russian forces tried to surround the city. Although they had some success, especially toward the southeast with the taking of Izium, the Russian push toward Kharkiv ultimately petered out.
And one of the other things that's sad, and I'm sure they'll never mention this because it makes Russia look somewhat humane, is at first Russia wasn't going to bomb Ukrainian industry, or they weren't going to drop bombs on the Ukrainian infrastructure. They were going to try and avoid that. But then Ukrainians started like setting up battalions behind apartment buildings, right? Using civilians as human shields and things like that. And the US and NATO kept funneling weapons, escalating the conflict and preventing a peace agreement. So eventually Russia said, we have no choice if we want to win. If we want this operation to be successful, we have to start crushing Ukrainian infrastructure with artillery and bombs. So now, the U.S. has helped Ukraine and brought freedom to Ukraine by prolonging this war and allowing Ukrainian infrastructure to just be devastated, to be crushed, which is why, I'm not, when I say this stuff, when I tell the truth and expose the lies about this war, it's not because I hate Ukraine. It's not because I want to see Ukraine destroyed. Right? What's destroying Ukraine is NATO. What's destroying Ukraine is this imperialist project to try and use Ukraine and the Ukrainian people as a proxy to attack U.S. enemies, to attack Russia. Right? So it's the U.S. and NATO using Ukraine as a proxy, as a human shield, that's getting Ukraine destroyed and leading their infrastructure to be decimated.
Amid the heightened shelling of Kharkiv on March 31st, a helicopter strike took place against an oil supply depot inside Russia in the city of Belgorod, noteworthy as it happened on the other side of the border. The Kremlin was quick to blame Kyiv, while Ukraine denied responsibility. Advance from the Donbass was slower in comparison to the other fronts, as the region had already been the setting of battles since 2014. As a result, Ukrainian troops there were already well entrenched. Meanwhile, the siege of Mariupol was underway. The battle included troops from the regular Russian army, as well as the Donetsk People's Republic militia. The urban warfare for control of the city was slow and bloody. In an official statement, the United Nations confirmed the deaths of 1,348 civilians in Mariupol.
There were so many people who died in Mariupol, including, this is where the Azov battalion was, decimated. They lost, a huge percentage of their people or their troops because they were just killed. They were killed by Russian forces, and a lot of Russians died in Mariupol too. But yeah, I believe, isn't that where Azov battalion troops ended up getting trapped too? they like were hiding in a bunker and running out of food. I don't know. This war has been dragging on for so long. I'm starting to get the events. They're starting to blur together in my mind a little bit.
But warned that the true death toll was likely higher. The UN also reported that 90% of the city's residential buildings had been damaged or destroyed. The city's defenders were eventually cornered into the Azovstal steelworks, a maze of a metallurgical facility that served as a well-defensible position. As a result, on April 21st, Putin ordered Russian troops not to storm it, opting to blockade it instead. The Russians did continue to shell the steelworks, with heavy airstrikes on the 27th and 28th of April. The humanitarian crisis in the city was becoming increasingly dire, and after a visit by the UN Security General to Moscow, the United Nations and the Red Cross started to run evacuations throughout a humanitarian corridor. Many civilians were still trapped in the steelworks, although they would continue to be pulled out during the following days. By May 7th, the Ukrainian government reported that all of the civilians in the steel plant had been evacuated. With many heavily injured and low on ammunition, food, and supplies, the remaining defenders surrendered by the 20th.
So that is, they were in the steel plant, is where a lot of those Azov battalion people were, and basically under siege and almost starved to death before they finally surrendered. But this is interesting from Cobra. Remember, it's Kiev, not Kiev. The ruling class uses the fake name because there are so many news articles that show Ukraine's crimes in Kiev. Never use Kiev. Interesting. That's an interesting tactic because if in 2015 or 2016, if you Googled Ukraine or you Googled Kiev, you would get, Ukraine has a corruption problem. Ukraine has a Nazi problem. Ukraine is a puppet of Western NGOs. Like, the media was being more honest about it. But then once the Russian intervention happened, they had to start beating the war drums and lying about what was going on and lying about the NATO influence in Ukraine. So to change the name so that people can't Google the articles that actually existed about Ukrainian fascism and Ukrainian corruption is really sneaky online propaganda tactic, which goes along with what we were talking about earlier on the stream.
Days later, Russia.
Cobra Commander, the U.S. ruling class is dumb, psychotic, and petty AF. They use Kyiv, just like they say CCP, to just be as disrespectful as possible. Could be that too, for sure, Jenny. It could also be that. I imagine it's a combination.
Russia reopened the port of Mariupol to commercial vessels following mine removal.
All right, one more. Actually, it's a linguistic difference from diverse dialects. I almost said dialectics. Kiev is less Russified. Okay. So there you go. Now we got 3 reasons that they might have started using the word Kyiv. I believe you all. I think it's probably a combination of all 3 of these reasons.
With Ukraine being a major producer of wheat, the taking, blockading, and mining of its Black Sea ports had serious global repercussions, with increased wheat prices and the threat of famine, especially in the Middle East. As a result, the Black Sea theater has also been significant. The Russian Navy drew first blood, taking control of Snake Island after their cruiser, Moskva, bombarded it. Russia has an overwhelming advantage at sea, which became even more pronounced once the Ukrainian Navy scuttled its flagship, the frigate Hetman Sahayadechny. Despite this, Ukraine managed to somewhat even the odds by sinking the Moskva with 2 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles. However, the Kremlin denies this, claiming that it was a munition explosion caused by a fire. Eventually, Moscow and Kyiv would reach an agreement brokered with 2 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles. However, the Kremlin denies this, claiming that it was a munition explosion caused by a fire. Eventually,
I don't remember what actually happened there. I don't remember what the truth of that one was. Sorry. I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of the conflict, I guess. We need to get Scott Ritter on the channel. He would know.
Moscow and Kyiv would reach an agreement brokered by the UN and Turkey, aiming to resume grain exports. After the retreat from Kyiv, the Russian military concentrated their efforts on the south and the east. Although they managed some advances, the Ukrainian military managed to hold the line for the most part. On the 6th of September, prompted by the wave of military aid from the west, Ukraine launched a surprise counteroffensive in Kharkiv, which successfully cleared the surrounding areas and eliminated any risk of losing the city.
That is wild that they're portraying it like a board game. I mean, that is kind of military strategy, because that's just the reality of it. You got to be like, we have this many troops here, and we know that can take out this many troops, but if we, take out this many troops, we're going to lose a bunch. You plan to have casualties, and, you're kind of playing with human life like it's a board game, and that's kind of just the reality of military strategy. But for a historian, to portray it as just like a battleship game between Putin and Zelensky is pretty callous. And it's not accurate because Zelensky is not the one, running the Ukrainian military strategy. That is NATO and the United States, who control Zelensky like a puppet.
15 days later, Putin announced partial mobilization, which was followed by an exodus of young Russian men from the country. In late September, Moscow would organize referendums in the Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia oblasts, and hurriedly proclaimed their annexations to the Russian Federation. These oblasts were not completely occupied by Russian forces, and the majority of the international community do not recognize the claims of the annexation. At the same time, the Ukrainian military was conducting an...
There you have it, the international community again. This time just the majority of the international community, though. I guess even Armchair Historian has to admit that a lot of countries actually did recognize these independent republics. But all that matters is that the majority of the people in these Donbass countries wanted to join Russia, right? So that's not an annexation. They have the right to self-determination and national sovereignty. So if they don't want to be part of the NATO puppet Nazi government that's blowing up their homes because of the language that they speak and because they are culturally Russian, they have the right to do that. That's why they had the referendums.
Offensive in the
But the referendums could have been like 100-0. 100% of people voting to join Russia and 0% of people voting to stay in Ukraine. And in Crimea, it was like, 88% to 12 or even higher. Regardless, though, the U.S. will call it an annexation no matter what. They'll call it a Russian invasion no matter what. They don't give a shit about sovereignty or self-determination. They give a shit about attacking Russia because Russia is going against the economic interests of finance capitalists in the U.S. All this talk of caring about self-determination and trying to prevent annexation, it's all just gobbledygook to justify imperialist warfare for economic purposes and political purposes, but ultimately economic purposes.
Although it would take them months, the Ukrainians managed to disrupt Russian supply lines to the point that it made their positions on the western bank of the Dnieper untenable. This was worsened by an attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge, which was a crucial supply line. After repeated attacks and being forced back, the Russian military decided to retreat from the provincial capital back to the eastern bank, successfully completing an orderly withdrawal. In the wake of the success of the Kherson offensive, the war had shifted back to the Donbass, where Wagner Group mercenaries have been involved in intense fighting to capture Bakhmut. This stage of the war has been characterized by brutal fighting with little forward movement for either side, with sites of trenches.
And I love how they attacked the Wagner Group, being like, this is a mercenary group that serves Putin. Oh, you mean like Blackwater in the U.S.? Like there are so many, or the private military contractors in the U.S.? The difference is that Wagner Group actually is controlled by Putin and is controlled by the Russian state versus Blackwater and the military-industrial complex in the U.S. control our government. And they'll start wars just because it makes them a lot of money.
And a pronounced no man's land, some have called this phase reminiscent of the First World War. A first among our videos, the conflict in Ukraine remains ongoing at the time of release. While today the front lines have become much more static than last year, now that the snow has thawed, new offensives have introduced some semblance of movement to the front once more, as Ukraine receives an increasing amount of military aid from the West. Join us next year for the 2023 recap of the war in Ukraine.
Sounds good. I think the 2022 recap was enough for now. Nothing about Boris Johnson going to Ukraine to block up a peace agreement. Nothing about Angela Merkel admitting that the U.S. never had plans to sign a peace agreement and that their NATO's goal was always to use Ukraine to attack Russia. Nothing about the millions and millions of dollars funneled into Ukraine to foment a coup in 2014. Nothing about the Ukrainian ethno-nationalists and U.S.-backed forces who burned trade unionists alive in Odessa or who fired upon and killed dozens of civilians in Maidan Square with snipers, which escalated the protests into an actual violent coup. None of these facts, none of these factual events that happened in reality are mentioned because those facts go against and counteract the U.S. and NATO narrative, right? So for a historian, it shouldn't matter, though. For a historian, for an academic, you should just be trying to tell the truth, right? You should be trying to lay out all the facts. Here's what happened. Here's what Ukraine and NATO did, and here's why Russia responded the way they did. Here's what Russia did and why Ukraine and NATO and Ukraine responded, right? Make your own decision. Draw your own conclusions from that. But instead, anything that might make NATO look bad, that might make the U.S. State Department look bad, that might make NATO look like the aggressors and make it look like they provoked Russia to this point, is just omitted, completely extracted from the video, versus anything that makes Russia look bad, or things that, if they were seen in context, would be understandable, why Russia did them, why Russia had an interest in doing these things, is, or anything that makes Russia look bad is stated, or, anything that makes them look, that's in a gray area, whatever the U.S. did to provoke what Russia did is omitted. So, like, there were NATO troops lined up on the border, the Ukrainian-Russian border. That part is omitted. But what they do tell you is that Russian troops were lined up on the border in response to those NATO troops. So if you look at the issue in its full context, okay, NATO has been expanding towards Russia's borders for years. They bombed the crap out of Yugoslavia and basically occupied that area and continued to push towards Russia's borders, even though they promised that they wouldn't. Now NATO's lining up troops right on Russia's border and looking like they're going to attack. So Russia sends troops to counteract that. Similar to if Russia was lining up troops on the U.S.-Canada border, we would send troops, to block them off and to prepare for an intervention. Right? But if you just isolate that, if you just completely disregard that the U.S. troops or NATO troops or Ukrainian troops were even there at all, it makes it look like Russia was the aggressor. It makes it look like Russia was lining up their troops on the Ukrainian border for no reason. You can't see the context, the actions by NATO that led Russia, that provoked Russia to respond. So it's ahistorical, it's revisionist, it's nonsense, it's propaganda. Right? That video, any historian who puts that out or believes that should be ashamed of themselves, because they're obviously omitting certain facts that make Russia look bad. And like I said, you don't have to support the Russian intervention. Right? Go ahead and say that you disagree with Russia lining up troops on the Ukrainian border, and you disagree with Russia launching the special military operation. Sure, I don't care. But don't lie. Don't lie and omit the fact that there were NATO troops lined up on their border, and that Angela Merkel has said the whole goal of that was always to attack Russia. Right? At least give all the facts so you know why Russia did what they did, even if you don't support it. Right? But that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to brainwash you. They're trying to propagandize you. They're trying to portray Russia as these big bad comic book villains who might come attack the U.S. at any second. Or these big bad comic book villains who are trying to destroy Ukraine just because they felt like it one day. Meanwhile, NATO and the U.S. continue to block a peace agreement and prolong the war and lead to Russians and Ukrainians to die en masse. Armchair propagandist. Armchair glowy. Absolutely. I got some real interesting chats here that I starred to look at later. We need Eddie's opinion on veganism. Well, I do admit that if you want to do something, and obviously we can't stop climate change.
Yes, I have a question for Secretary Albright.
Right? We need structural change. The entire economy is based on fossil fuels and non-renewables. And every industry is dependent on fossil fuels and oil. So we need socialism. We need, to abolish capitalism if we want to actually attack the climate crisis. But on an individual level, the number one thing you can do to decrease your carbon footprint and use less fossil fuels is to be vegan, is to stop eating meat, because it just takes so many resources to raise meat. That being said, I am not vegan. I like meat. And I don't think socialism means everybody just goes vegan. And I don't, that's nice if you're vegan to try and counteract the climate crisis. More power to you. You're a stronger man than me. But ultimately, that's not going to counteract the climate crisis. We need systemic change. Otherwise, the crisis is just going to continue. And, you know, don't harass people who eat meat or go into, I don't know, restaurants and harass the workers and the cooks because they make a living by cooking meat. I disagree with that. And I think vegans have made themselves look pretty crazy with a lot of that and distracted from their message. And then Zorro also says Slava salami. So yeah, that's my opinion on veganism. I like salami too much. So Slava salami. I love animals, me too. I will not eat bug. I'm not giving up meat where omnivore. Yeah, plus like I've tried going plant-based for wrestling and I just feel worse. I feel weaker. It just is what it is. Like I know it varies for everybody, and I'm sure you know, I could have done the plant-based diet healthier, but I just feel healthier for athletics when I eat meat. I will not eat bugs. Yeah, that's the other thing. The World Economic Forum, look up the Great Reset. I know a lot of right-wing conspiracy theory type people talk about the Great Reset, but that doesn't mean it's fake. It's actually real. The World Economic Forum actually wants like an agricultural reset. And the idea is that we'll eat bugs. Like they'll have bug farms, sustainable bug farms. So the rich, the people like Bill Gates can continue to eat meat while they feed bugs to the servants, to the peons. So yeah, that's what I'm definitely against that. Go meat. Yeah. Bugs are meat and they are delicious. Don't be scared. Dude, I am scared of eating bugs. I'm sorry. I can't eat bugs. Actually, I probably could eat bugs, but I don't want to. I mean, industrial agriculture isn't so great. You eat bugs anyway. Industrial agriculture is what allowed human societies to explode, though. That's what allowed us to produce enough food to have the population size that we have today. So in a lot of ways, it is kind of great because the power that it gave us over the environment and the power that it gave us to feed people. And we could do industrial agriculture in a much more sustainable way. It's just not incentivized under capitalism. And you eat bugs anyways? Sounds like something the World Economic Forum would say. You eat bugs anyways, just eat the grasshoppers instead of steak. No. Under socialism, everyone gets steak. If we figure out how to make steak made out of grasshoppers that tastes good, I'll eat it. But until then, I'm against the Great Reset. All right, this is a video that Jacob sent us.
Yes, I have a question for Secretary Albright. Why bomb Iraq when other countries have committed similar violations? Turkey, for example. Can I finish? For example, Turkey has bombed Kurdish citizens. Saudi Arabia has tortured political and religious dissidents. Why does the U.S. apply different standards of justice to these countries?
Let me say that when there are problems such as you have described, we point them out and make very clear our opposition to them. But there is no one that has done to his people or to his neighbors what Saddam Hussein has done.
My microphone is off. There we are. What do you have to say about dictators of countries like Indonesia, who we sell weapons to, yet they are slaughtering people in East Timor? What do you have to say about Israel, who is slaughtering Palestinians, who impose martial law?
Dang. He wrecked this woman. He destroyed this woman. By the way, when Madeleine Albright passed away, Ilhan Omar, famous socialist from the Fraud Squad, was like, "Oh, rest in peace to such a great woman, such a great leader because of her gender. You know, what a trailblazer. We can have women who bomb Iraqi children too. It doesn't have to just be old white men." Using identity politics to praise one of the worst war criminals in U.S. history, basically the female Kissinger.
What do you have to say about that? Those are our allies. Why do we...
Someone who said it was worth it to kill 500,000 children in Iraq. Someone who had her hypocrisy pointed out to her face like this and just continued to lie about it. Meaning she knows She knows the hundreds of thousands of children who have been killed because of her policy, who have been starved to death because of her policy. And she don't care. And not only does she not care, but she's going to lie about it to try and justify it and to try and do more of it in the future. Rest in peace.
Sell weapons to these countries. Why do we support them? Why do we bomb Iraq when it commits similar problems?
Ilhan Omar liked Thatcher too. Maybe I'm getting them mixed up. Maybe Ilhan Omar praised Thatcher and not Albright. I could be switching those up, but yeah, same thing. Using identity politics to praise a neoliberal war criminal.
There are very
Anna Kasparian's role model. Maybe it was Anna Kasparian who praised Albright, but again, same thing. Identity politics used to justify imperialism.
various examples of things that are not right in this world, and the United States is trying. I really am surprised that people feel that it is necessary to defend the rights of Saddam Hussein, when what we ought to be thinking about is how to make sure that he does not use weapons of mass destruction.
I'm not defending the
He never had weapons of mass destruction, you fucking liar. Look at this is the face of a true narcissistic psychopath. She knows that she killed millions of people and she's still just going to repeat the same old lies. Yeah, but we got to stop Saddam Hussein. We have to sanction Iraq and starve 500,000 children to stop Saddam Hussein. Yeah, okay. We got to stop Saddam Hussein from killing his own people. That's why we're going to starve 500,000 of his people. That makes a lot of sense, Madeline.
least. What I am saying is that there needs to be consistent application of U.S. foreign policy. We cannot support people who are committing the same violations because they are political allies. That is not acceptable. We cannot violate UN resolutions when it is convenient to us. You're not answering my question, Madam Albright.
Man, what an epic destruction. What an epic destruction. Knowledge equals power. I like this channel. Good for them. Good for them. That was a great video. Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, wild. And Madeleine Albright, of course, also said on 60 Minutes that it was worth it. Worth it to starve 500,000 Iraqi children with U.S. sanctions. So, yeah. I'm sorry, I was reading something real quick. Wild. I don't know much about Indonesia killing in East Timor. It was actually one of the most horrific U.S.-backed murder campaigns in history. Definitely not my area of expertise either, but I've been meaning to react to Mr. Beast forever. Or not Mr. Beast, Mr. Beat. Because he's got a lot of videos about history. I've just never found one that was interesting enough to me. But who killed more, Mao, Stalin, or Hitler? It's absolute garbage. Black Book of Communism propaganda. It's clearly horseshoe theory. Yeah, I'll react to that at some point. I'm probably going to end the stream here, though, because we've been going for a good 2 hours. We're about to hit the 2-hour mark. So thank you all very much for hanging out with us. It's been a fun stream. Talked about a lot of different things. If you want to support us, patreon.com/MidwesternMarks, or become a YouTube member, a Twitch subscriber, or whatever else. Join our Discord at the link tree. Follow us everywhere. Thanks for joining. Yeah. Solidarity I don't know if I have anything else to say. I felt a little bit, my brain was a little bit fried during today's stream. I didn't feel as like sharp as I always feel, probably because I worked with kids for 3.5 hours before I got on stream. But it was a fun stream. It was a blast. It was fun to yell about shitty historical videos and cover the censorship stuff on TikTok that I think is so ridiculous. So thank you all very much for being here. We'll see you next time. That's all I got. Peace.
Without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.